Welcome to the DIT 2016 Step 1 Primer video on brainstem anatomy. I'm Dr. Mike McInnes, one of the chief educators for Doctors in Training. We've chosen this video to be part of the primer series because neuroanatomy is a daunting subject for a lot of students, and it's very high yield for USMLE Step 1 and COMLEX Level 1. But knowing where to find these structures is clinically very useful as well because it makes all the brainstem stroke syndromes just lock into place, as we're going to see in the next video. But for now, here's Dr. Chris Lewis to take you through the 3-question warm-up quiz, and then I'll be back to talk neurology.
It's time for another 3-question warm-up. Let's get going. What effect might aminoglycosides have on a developing fetus? So remember, it's bad because it can cause ototoxicity. Next, what molecule targets proteins in the endoplasmic reticulum for lysosomes? Remember, that's going to be mannose 6-phosphate. Next question, what birth defect can result from the following teratogenic agents? So first we have ACE inhibitors. Remember, that can cause renal damage. Folate antagonists, so this would be neural tube defects. We know that decreased folic acid can cause neural tube defects, which is why we give pregnant women folic acid supplements. So it would make sense that a folate antagonist would cause neural tube defects. Next we have tetracyclines, so that can cause discoloration of the teeth. Lithium can cause Ebstein's anomaly, which is displacement of the septal and posterior tricuspid valve leaflets toward the apex, leading to atrialization of the right ventricle. All right, that's it for the warm-up. Let's get to that lecture now.
This video is all about everybody's favorite subject, neuroanatomy. We're still working up to unraveling the mystery of brainstem strokes, laying down the foundations before we get to the real nitty-gritty in the next video. So far, we've covered the cranial nerves and the cranial nerve nuclei, and now we're going to look at how these nuclei are arranged within the brainstem. But first, let's review the major spinal cord tracts, which obviously have to pass through the brainstem on their way to and from the brain. There are 3 main spinal tracts we need to discuss: the dorsal columns, the spinothalamic tract, and the lateral coracospinal tract. So we're going to focus on the location of these tracts later on. This is just a little preview. For now, I want to focus on what kind of information these tracts carry and where they decussate. So let's start with the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. This is the pathway that carries fine touch, vibration sense, and proprioception signals from the body to the brain. So this tract enters the spinal cord from the extremities or from the trunk, and it enters the dorsal columns on the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Now, in the dorsal columns, it ascends on the ipsilateral side of the cord until it reaches the medulla, which is where it decussates or crosses. So that's worth knowing. The dorsal columns decussate in the medulla, and then they become the medial lemniscus. Now, we're going to look at the medial lemniscus within the brainstem in a few minutes. And then the medial lemniscus ascends to the thalamus in the ventral posterolateral nucleus, or the VPL of the thalamus. And then that projects to the sensory cortex. The thalamus is kind of like a relay station between the spinal cord and the cortex. Now, you probably won't have to regurgitate a bunch of these picky details for step 1. They mostly want you to be able to localize lesions. So remember, proprioception, vibration sense, and fine touch are carried by the dorsal columns, and it's going to decussate in the medulla and then become the medial lemniscus in the brainstem. Next is the spinothalamic tract, which carries pain and temperature sensation. Remember, the tracts are named for where they come from first and then where they're going. So the spinothalamic tract is carrying pain and temperature sensation from the spine to the thalamus. So the nerves enter the cord and they ascend just 1 or 2 levels in something called Lissauer's tract. And then they decussate in the anterior white commissure, just anterior to the gray matter in the center of the spinal cord. So the spinothalamic pathway decussates in the anterior white commissure, and then it ascends contralaterally. And eventually it's going to reach the thalamus relay station and get to the sensory cortex. Now, this is different from the dorsal columns, which ascended all the way to the brainstem before they crossed in the medulla. Now, there's a similar tract for pain and temperature sensation of the face, which is called the trigeminothalamic tract, because remember, the trigeminal nerve provides sensory innervation of the face. And the trigeminothalamic tract and the spinothalamic tract run together in the brainstem. But cranial nerves generally don't decussate. So in the right side of the brainstem, the spinothalamic tract is carrying pain and temperature sensation from the left side of the body. And adjacent to that, you find the trigeminothalamic tract carrying pain and temperature sensation from the right side of the face. Then our third spinal tract for right now is going to be the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract is carrying motor information from the cortex to the spine. It's corticospinal. So from the motor cortex, the signal is going to go down through the internal capsule, through the brainstem, into the medullary pyramids, and there it decussates in the caudal medulla. And then that goes down to the spinal cord. And we'll talk about that again when we focus on the spinal cord in another video. Now we're going to look at some cross-sectional anatomy of various levels of the brainstem. Some students do get asked to identify structures on a brainstem drawing, but again, you're much more likely to have to identify the location of a brainstem lesion based on the clinical presentation. Now we're going to cover those brainstem lesions in the next video, but understanding the cross-sections is going to make identifying the lesion a lot easier. In your study guide, we have 3 drawings of the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So number 4 shows the rostral midbrain. So technically, each level of the brainstem can be subdivided into a rostral portion and a caudal portion. Rostral means beak, kind of like a rooster, rostral. And then caudal means tail. So the rostral midbrain is the portion of the midbrain closest to the beak or the nose, and the caudal midbrain is the portion closest to the tail. So again, this is a drawing of the rostral midbrain, the superior portion of the midbrain, the part closest to the nose, farthest from the tail. And you know it's the rostral midbrain because you can see a prominent red nucleus on each side. So if you see the red nucleus, you know you're in the rostral midbrain. Now this white space in the center of the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct, which is filled with CSF. And the darker area surrounding the aqueduct is the periaqueductal gray matter. Now, because this is the rostral or superior midbrain, posterior to the aqueduct, we find the superior colliculi. If you flip back a few pages to the cranial nerve drawings, you can see the superior colliculi up here in the midbrain. We said the superior colliculi house the vertical gaze center, so a lesion up here is going to cause paralysis of upward gaze. Now, speaking of cranial nerves, which cranial nerve nuclei do we find in the midbrain? Well, if 5, 6, 7, 8 are in the pons, then you can remember that 3 and 4 are a little higher in the midbrain. And remember that the cranial nerve nuclei descend in numerical order from top to bottom. So in the superior midbrain, you find cranial nerve 3 nuclei, which are these 2 black dots. And then in the inferior or caudal midbrain, instead of the cranial nerve 3 nuclei, you'd find the nuclei for cranial nerve 4. So moving laterally, you have the medial lemniscus. Now I know it's weird that the medial lemniscus is found laterally in the midbrain, but down in the medulla and in the pons, it's located much more medially, as we're going to see. We're going to see the medial lemniscus traveling throughout the brainstem. Remember, that's carrying vibration and proprioception and fine touch information from the dorsal columns up to the thalamus. So I want you to keep track of where the medial lemniscus is going through all these drawings. Now nearby you have the spinothalamic tract, and then lateral to that is the medial geniculate body. And on the anterior part of the midbrain, these 2 big wing-looking things are the cerebral peduncles, which house the corticobulbar tract and the corticospinal tract. We're going to see the corticospinal tract traveling through all these levels of the brainstem too, so keep track of that as well. And then the dark stripe of tissue is the substantia nigra, which is damaged in patients with Parkinson's disease. So that's the rostral midbrain. Now, we don't have a drawing of the caudal midbrain, but again, you can identify the caudal midbrain because you won't see the red nucleus, and then instead of the superior colliculus, you're going to have the inferior colliculus in the caudal midbrain. And instead of cranial nerve 3 nuclei, you're going to have the cranial nerve 4 nuclei. Next up is the pons. And for the pons, I want you to divide it into the medial pons and the lateral pons. So let's start with the medial pons. The medial pons contains the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is involved in eye control. It also contains the medial lemniscus, again. Remember I told you to keep track of that one. It also contains the abducens nerve nucleus and the corticospinal tract, which is traveling down from the cortex, and again, it's eventually going to end up in those medullary pyramids. And the reason that you want to lump these medial structures together is that they receive blood supply from the paramedian branches of the basilar artery, which penetrate the pons. So a basilar artery stroke could selectively knock out all these medial structures. Now the lateral aspect of the pons is supplied by a circumferential artery, which circles around the outside of the pons. In this case, this circumferential artery is the AICA, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the AICA supplies blood to the structures in the lateral pons, which include the lateral spinothalamic tract, the cranial nerve 7 nucleus, the cranial nerve 8 nucleus, and the spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract, which is associated with cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 5 has a really huge nucleus that runs from the top of the pons all the way down into the medulla. It's enormous. And it's also very complicated. But remember, the pons contains the nuclei for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, 8, and all of those are pictured here. And the most inferior part of the brainstem is the medulla. So there are two structures that tell you you're looking at the medulla. The inferior olivary nucleus, which is this big squiggly area, and also the medullary pyramids on the anterior aspect of the medulla. So when you see those, you should immediately recognize you're looking at the medulla. So again, what's found in the pyramids? The corticospinal tract, descending from the motor cortex. Now, this happens to be a drawing of the rostral medulla. And again, you need to think about a medial portion of the medulla and a lateral portion. The medial medulla contains the medullary pyramid, the medial lemniscus again, and here you can see it's rotated 90 degrees, so it really is truly medial in the medulla, and also the hypoglossal nucleus, so that's cranial nerve 12. And all three of those medial structures are supplied by the anterior spinal artery, which runs right along the anterior surface of the medulla, kind of in the groove between the pyramids. But the lateral portion of the rostral medulla is supplied by the pica, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which wraps around the medulla on its way to the cerebellum. The lateral medulla contains the lateral spinothalamic tract, carrying that pain and temperature sensation from the body. The spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract are also located here, as well as the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the vestibular nuclei. And we said that cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12 all originate in the medulla. So we already saw the hypoglossal nucleus back in the medial medulla. That's cranial nerve 12. But out here in the lateral medulla, you have the nucleus ambiguus, which we said is involved in speech and swallowing. So it contributes motor neurons to the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9, and also the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. There's also a dorsal motor nucleus, which contributes to the vagus nerve, and the nucleus of the solitary tract, also called the nucleus solitarius, which also contributes to the vagus. So again, you definitely want to know which brainstem structures are medial and which ones are lateral, and also know what level you find them. But it's probably much lower yield to worry about being able to label all these images. Now, we've mentioned that the vagus nerve is the primary parasympathetic nerve in the body, and now it has a bunch of different functions: parasympathetics, motor, general sensory, special sensory, and so on. Well, because of this complexity, the vagus nerve receives contributions from several different nuclei. The nucleus ambiguus contributes motor innervation to the pharynx, the larynx, and the upper esophagus. And again, I want you to associate the nucleus ambiguus with speech and swallowing. Then the nucleus solitarius receives the vagus nerve's sensory information from the pharynx and the trachea and the esophagus, and also taste sensation from the very back of the tongue. It also receives the taste information from the facial nerve and from the glossopharyngeal nerve. And it also receives information from the carotid body chemoreceptors via the glossopharyngeal nerve too. So lots of things going on in the solitary nucleus. And then the dorsal motor nucleus contributes parasympathetic fibers to the GI tract and the heart and the lungs. So don't get tripped up by the fact that it's called the dorsal motor nucleus. It actually contains parasympathetics. So what about the sympathetic nervous system? Where's that located? Well, the sympathetic nervous system has its cell bodies not in the brainstem, but rather in the spinal cord at the thoracic and lumbar levels. And these cell bodies synapse with the sympathetic ganglia outside the spinal cord, such as the superior cervical ganglion. And this brings us to a brief discussion of Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome is a disorder of the sympathetic innervation to the face. So the three main features of Horner syndrome are ptosis, or drooping of the eyelid, miosis, or constriction of the pupil, and anhidrosis, which is absence of sweating. And that can lead to some flushing of the affected side of the face. So this sympathetic innervation of the face might be disrupted with a lung tumor up in the apex of the lung that compresses the sympathetic trunk as it travels up from the thoracic spine to the face. You can also see Horner syndrome in certain spinal cord disorders, such as advanced syringomyelia, and also with a stroke of the lateral medulla. We're going to go over that in the next video. But first, let's look at the end of session quiz. First question, what artery supplies the medullary pyramid and the medial lemniscus in the medulla? That's the anterior spinal artery. The next question, what artery supplies the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the nucleus ambiguus, and the lateral spinothalamic tract in the medulla? Well, these are all supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or the pica. The next question, where does each of the following spinal tracts decussate? So the first two, the corticospinal tract and the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, decussate in the medulla, and then the lateral spinothalamic tract decussates in the anterior white commissure of the spinal cord, which is 2 or 3 spinal levels above where it entered the cord. And our last question, what's the triad of Horner syndrome? You got to remember this one, ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis. So that's it for the end of session quiz. I'll see you next time.